In the last video of our series about impact entrepreneurship, I will finally cover the elephant in the room, climate change startups. Again, I'm not an expert, and what follows is mostly a big picture summary of what I've read and what I see currently on the market. I personally categorize the startups in the climate change space into two big buckets. First, startups dealing with carbon emissions, and secondly, startups in the climate change resilience space. By carbon emission startup, I mean the startups that tackle the major cause behind climate change, CO2 emissions, from the angle of measuring carbon emission, but also reducing it or capturing it, and finally offsetting it. You've probably guessed, but in this category, I include all the startups whose core value proposition is to measure your carbon footprint so that you can ultimately act on it. The current narrative in that space is that before we can really reduce carbon emissions, we need to measure it. This is why a myriad of founders are rushing to offer carbon footprint calculators, whether it's for consumers or businesses. And this is probably the most crowded category of all. You can find literally tens of startups that will offer to estimate your personal carbon footprint based on your consumption habits by fetching data from your banking apps or from your mobile phone GPS, for example. Same on the B2B side, with an increasing number of startups, from generalists to specialized, that help businesses measure their carbon emission. As an example of a verticalized approach, you can check Tanso, which focuses mainly on industrial manufacturers. I personally believe that we see so many projects being created in the measure space because it's one of the low-hanging fruit ideas that most people can relate to. I also think that it attracts the most VC money at the moment because the products in that space are mostly software based and don't require a lot of capital upfront or specific industrial knowledge, which is generally the case for the startups in our next category, Reduce. Startups in this category help mostly businesses to reduce their current carbon emissions. It can be done by creating less polluting types of materials, such as Heimdall, which is working on a greener concrete, or by optimizing logistics chains, like Sourceful, which focuses on the sourcing part, or by reducing energy consumption or waste production. As you can see, there's a lot of different ways to reduce carbon emissions. But what characterizes most startups in that space is that they require industry-specific expertise and often more upfront capital in order to build the product, especially the ones with the hardware component. These factors, combined with the fact that the business potential of most of these startups are still not proven, explain why you have less founders in that space, but also why VCs are putting less money there too. Moving to the capture category, you'll find all the startups whose aim is not to reduce carbon emissions, but to directly take it out of the air. Again, you have a myriad of approaches, from direct capture companies such as Climeworks that builds factories that suck up carbon directly from the air, to afforestation companies that do that by planting trees. What characterizes most of the startups in that space is that they require a huge amount of capital and have most of the time a business model which is not aligned with the time frame of a typical VC. These are very long-term bets with a lot of uncertainty on the business side, and this is why most of them are not VC compatible. But this could change if a real carbon market emerges. The last types of startups that I see regularly are carbon offset startups, which are basically buying carbon capture from the companies in our capture bucket to sell it to companies that want to reduce their carbon footprint through an offsetting mechanism. It's probably the space that I found personally the less interesting because it doesn't move the needle in the long term and is often used for greenwashing purposes. If we hear a lot about the startups in the carbon emission space, I think that there's a less covered part of the spectrum, which are the startups helping us build resilience in a world increasingly impacted by extreme weather events, whether it's tropical storms, floods, forest fires, or rising water level. To illustrate concretely what companies do in that space, we can take the example of FireMaps, which is a B2B marketplace that connects homeowners with local professionals who build defenses to protect houses from wildfire. Or Forerunner, which offer a easy-to-use flood risk mitigation tools for local governments. From a pure VC model perspective, I think that the companies in the resilience space are super interesting because not only they are useful for people, but they also target a market which is going to generate hundreds of billions of dollars of cost. Just to give you an example, we recently had devastating floods in Germany and its global cost is estimated at more than 10 billions of euros. So it's definitely a space that shouldn't be overlooked, quite the opposite.